Hi there, welcome to the podcast. We will be speaking with Arooba Ahmed in New York. As you know, we talk about sustainability, we talk about wellness, responsible travel, we touch on organizations and people that are doing the right thing. Sometimes, however, people and organizations do not do the right thing. They pretend to do so for their own benefit, for their investors, for their own back pocket, but certainly not for the communities of the areas they operate in. So Arooba wrote what I believe is a great article about exactly that. And she wrote that in the Journal of Sustainable Development, State of the Planet, at the Columbia Earth Institute. So I thought it was fantastic to have on the podcast. You can make up your own mind with regards to the article. If you would like to support the podcast, please do so and go to our website. That's podcasts.earth. And without further ado, here's the podcast with Arooba Ahmed. So here today on the show with me is Arooba Ahmed. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. And I have Arooba on the show because I read an article, how ecotourism can harm indigenous communities. Now, first of all, I believe you're a scholar at Columbia University. That's in New York. I'm obviously myself in London. And the article was published last week on June the 2nd, and that was published in the Journal of Sustainable Development, State of the Planet, for the Columbia Earth Institute, which is the research institute at Columbia University, and its mission is to address complex issues facing the planet and its inhabitants, and the focus is on sustainable development. So first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what's it like at the moment in New York? Because you have been very hard hit as well by the coronavirus, eh?
Yes. I believe that we are heading into phase 3 now, which is some of the commercial stores are starting to open up again, but we still have to follow pretty strict social distancing measures, as you know. We were hit pretty hard in the city.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So the article, how ecotourism can harm indigenous communities, I really liked it for two reasons. First of all, I've been to one of the regions that you mentioned in Kenya, Masai Mara, and I've seen with my own eyes the villages, tourist villages, which is just like a tourist trap. And I don't really think there's much going back to the communities there. But what is the background for the article? Why did you write it?
Yes, of course. So this topic actually arose back in December when I was still during school, because winter break, I guess, is the best time for college students and their families to start traveling. So I was talking to friends who want to go on some more sustainable tours. And I guess the first thing that came to mind was, well, if they're going to these ecologically stressed places, let's say Argentina, what are the actual effects that no one's really talking about?
Okay, that makes total sense. And did you go to Argentina or Kenya yourself to check it out, or have you been, or are you planning to go, or how do we see that?
Well, after reading about all these effects on the indigenous communities, I don't know if I want to go on these eco tours myself, but I definitely would want to go one day to see if I can make a difference there, maybe through an NGO, something that I could do to volunteer my time to help. But as of now, I have actually not been personally.
It makes sense to me. So obviously there's a lot of talk about, ecotourism at the moment. It's almost like a buzzword, and a lot of people are actually putting that into their plans to attract a certain type of traveler. This is not a good thing, correct? What you're saying is really you may want to consider how ecotourism actually impacts the local communities where these tours take place. And why do you think that? You said you read some articles. What is your reasoning behind this, if I may ask?
My reasoning behind why I said that that statement. So basically, I did a bit of literature review, and to summarize a few studies, like Correa et al. 2011 and Baker et al. 2018, I realized that alongside the serious hazards to wildlife, it's actually been demonstrated by many instances in the past that in practice, ecotourism has often failed to deliver the expected benefits to indigenous communities. And it really has to do with the distribution of revenue by companies because of vague rules on how ecotourism has to be conducted. Companies can actually bypass communication with the local peoples and instead focus on making profit and keep all the benefits to themselves.
Yeah.
And it's really prevalent in Southern and Eastern Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, because there are very few ecotourism projects managed by indigenous communities, since the governmental policies in that region support mass tourism and research usage rather than ecotourism projects or indigenous rights.
Okay, that makes sense as well. And in your article, you give the definition of ecotourism by the IUCN. I did an interview actually with the former president of the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Basically, they define this as environmentally responsible travel that prioritizes conservation, leaves a low visitor impact, and allows for socioeconomic involvement of all the local people. And then you give some pros and some cons. And you say the pros can be financial supporting the local people. You yourself become more culturally aware. And then you say that now you actually say now that the money is not distributed by the tour operators back to local communities. Is correct?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So it's actually the opposite. So the local people do not benefit from this at all, and they also create a culture that fetishizes them. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I guess. So I was reading a paper. I had to do extensive literature review for this because this is a topic that actually isn't really talked about in like mainstream articles. Yep. So one of these papers I was reading about, they talked about how ecotourism can also negatively impact indigenous livelihood. And they stated pretty well that since ecotourism requires that indigenous communities adapt themselves to a different regime of wildlife exploitation, it like imposes a view on the indigenous life that's not necessarily in agreement with the real livelihoods of the indigenous communities.
Right.
And I guess I really thought about this a lot after reading Michel de Montaigne's essays, which is on cannibals.
Yeah.
And it talks about the native people, which Montaigne describes are so pure and natural in comparison to the Europeans he described. And after reading this, I found extreme parallels to the tourism industry. And I realized that the views that we are imposing on them are not necessarily their own, but an idealized natural version of them that we want to see.
Right.
And that's where the word fetishizing comes in.
From. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what you're saying is that we have an idea of what these indigenous people, these local tribes look like, and that is what they're giving us, except that is not really what it looks like anymore. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And they're using that in order to create this kind of natural version. And it's like, so we're so obsessed with all things natural to the point that we would want to change how an entire community looks to achieve it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you think these communities are held back that way, or?
I suppose because they are also, restricted by the financial burdens, because actually a lot of times, so like these ecotourism communities had actually handed over land to investors for like exclusive use.
Yep.
So these largely pastoral people agreed not to like graze flocks of huge livestock, and investors don't pay for land at all. And they draft agreements that are basically locking them into these agreements, and they can no longer do anything to get out of them regardless of legal action. So there's contracts being signed by someone. Is that being signed by the local communities themselves or by the governments, or what do you think? Yeah, so there's actually been, I believe in Kenya, actually, their acts of omission and commission were done by lawyers as well as representatives of respected environmental organizations, UN bodies, wildlife conservation organizations, and even national wildlife management corporations. Yeah. So these legal agreements are taken part by many different people. Right,
fair enough. And it turns out to be, do they know that what they're signing when they're signing this, or what do you think?
I don't believe that they know, because a lot of times they actually come back and they ask, like, we want to get out of this agreement once they realize what the actual agreement says. And after these landowners start to make use of their land, but because they're so legally bound, they can't do anything about it.
Fair enough. Then you say as well that a lot of vacations are classified as ecotours, but there's no international regulation for that. There's no specific guidelines for that, even though you just mentioned contracts signed by World Life Organizations and by the UN, but still there's no guidelines. Do you think that's the problem, that there's no specific guidelines for these ecotours?
I do believe that this is the greatest mechanical drawback of implementing an ecotour at this time, because a lot of studies have actually noted that ecotourism has the potential to solve so many problems that regular tourism causes, but only if effective management is practiced. And this doesn't happen because there are no standardized rules about the tour. So companies are free to do whatever they want as long as it looks sustainable to the eye.
And how can it be solved, do you reckon?
So I suppose some fundamental conditions must be met. So I guess the economic benefits must be accessible to the target population of the communities, and they definitely need secure holdings over the land in which the ecotourism takes place.
And what body do you think should really take care of this? The government, local government, or an international body, United Nations? What do you think?
My idea would be that each country should agree on a similar set of laws to enforce, since there's no international organization with jurisdiction over the actions of each specific country. And I guess that as you go more local, those laws should be able to be enforced more strictly.
Makes sense as well. But obviously, if there has to be like a similar set of guidelines for each country, then those guidelines have to come from somewhere. So if you're thinking about an international body, what comes to mind? What do you think might be best?
Well, currently the UN has been involved in these ecotours, as I said earlier, with the people that are involved in those agreements, creating those legal agreements. So I suppose that perhaps if the UN were able to output something like some kind of like overall more, first of all, I believe that a stricter definition of an ecotour would be best, because then right away from off the bat, there would be a lot of that'd be able to eliminate a lot of these supposed quote unquote ecotours that claim to be sustainable. So that I guess would be the best first action to do.
Okay. Pretty much we've had this question already, but what they present to the tourist is an image of the indigenous communities that we think that we want to see is almost like biased, I suppose. But it's not really the fact of what the communities now look like. And I've been to Kenya. I've been to the Masai Mara. I did some volunteering there, and I saw the villages where tourists go. And as soon as they come, it's almost like an act they have. They start dancing and everything. It's a real tourist trap. But as you say, it doesn't come back to the people at all. How do you think that can be solved in a place like that, where in the Masai Mara most of the tour organizations have their place already for a long, long time? Because I was there like 25 years ago, I think, and so that's something that might be very hard to break. Or what do you think?
Right. So I actually was very much pondering upon this. And I think that this really stems from us, because we have these types of prejudices and biases. So I guess in order to break this cycle of this like sort of abuse of the local community, we should start with changing our views. We cannot accept this portrait that's painted by the ecotourism companies of what Native people look like. And I guess it would start with also educating ourselves before blindly submitting to this propaganda, so we can force companies to confer with the local communities on what actually goes into the ecotour. That is also
very clear indeed. Do you think that the communities really do not receive any benefit whatsoever from the industry, or you think it's very little, or you think that the companies that are there take most of the revenue and just choose not to give back, or how do you feel about this?
Right. So I don't think that every single ecotourism company is blindly abusing their indigenous community, the indigenous community. That would be a huge overstatement. But I do believe that the majority of the industry is, to some extent, manipulating the indigenous communities. Although some communities may receive less, like more benefit, most of them, such as even in China, and the majority of the economic benefits in the ecotourism sectors go to stakeholders outside the local community. Yeah,
even outside the country, I have the feeling somehow. But you're absolutely right. So you mentioned in your article Rob Nixon, and he mentioned quite a few things. Is that one of the references that you refer to, or?
Yes, I did. I read his book, The Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, and it really goes into depth on the issue. And he commented specifically on game lodges, which are mainly where mainly Western tourists came to stay during the tours. And he argued that these spaces created an environment that is detached from the rest of the world because they denied the existence of the modernity in these communities.
Okay. And what he says as well, that's the worst part is that they're advertised as being good for the communities, but actually not. And
exactly.
Yeah, and also they have no influence at all in the creation of these tours as well. Is that something that you would like to comment on?
Yes, definitely. So a lot of times when these when they are bought into these legal bindings, they really don't have a say in what, but they just simply sign a piece of paper and then the land is the investors. So if it were to be, my ideal ecotour would be created by and for the indigenous, created by the indigenous community, because I guess that's where the source, their culture, their language, that is not really easily replicated by someone who has not experienced that. So I think that if they were to play a role in the creation, it would have a drastically different outlook, different look if they were to.
Yeah, no, of course. I actually did an interview with a gentleman in India from Goat Village, and those were set up from within the community, and he also won the prize at the World Travel Market last year. For sustainable eco tourism at that point. So that is fantastic. I also did interview the government of Guyana, and I would like to have your view on that. They actually involve the local people right from the beginning, right from the get-go, and they don't take the land or anything like that. They just help them create a tourism industry within their area, within their community, which all the proceeds go directly back to that community as well. Would that be okay in your eyes if the government or any entity really would work with the local communities to build up a tourist industry, and that might be beneficial for themselves? Would that be all right with you, or would it still be something that you think,
Well, hearing about that gives me hope for the future of the ecotourism industry. If all the profits are going to the local community, then yes, that would be a wonderful resolution to this aspect of the ecotourism issue.
Okay.
But so in Guyana, it sounds like the local people, if the local people are so thoroughly involved, it could serve as a great model to address the loopholes and monitor each step of the process. Because looking at how the documents are so easily manipulated in the examples that I mentioned from Kenya, I would think the process of obtaining local representation, making sure that they address the documentation would have to be an important step to address. And it looks like the government of Guyana is doing a great job of doing that.
Yeah, and do you think that could be replicated in other areas? And if in other areas like Kenya are so far gone, so many years down the drain and have never been changed, how could that be replicated in those countries, in your view?
Well, I think the first thing would be for the people who are interested in going on these eco tours to say something, first of all, because as long as these people continue to go for the current eco tours, there's no reason for them to change how they are, because the indigenous communities cannot say anything. And I guess the people who are going on these eco tours are the only real factor that comes into play, because they are the ones who are investing in it, giving and driving the profit. So I guess they would have to begin with them.
Okay. Now, there's quite a few articles from different areas. One from Terra Incognita, one from USA Today, which is obviously from the US. One from The Guardian, which is in the UK. And they all talk very much about the advantages of ecotourism, saying that it's so good for the people, good for the environment. But a lot of times that I read that, it really says it can be good for the people. It can give back and create employment opportunities. And even the USA Today said ecotourism companies can help give back to the community by offering training in useful skills. They don't actually say they do so. And pros and cons within these articles, they say that If done right, it can channel resources to the correct places, to species. They can indeed create employment opportunities for local people. You can preserve the local culture, but when it's done badly, it can distort the local economy, change local customs and cultures. Now, in these times, there's more and more talk about these issues because everyone seems to want to be more sustainable and more responsible where tourism is concerned. And there's a few areas as well that are being taken up by NGOs and by non-profit organizations and run by volunteers. One that comes to mind is in Nicaragua, run by volunteers based in North Carolina, so in the US. So it's a non-profit organization, and they say part of the income is reinvested in rural water projects, local schools. Any thoughts on that? Do you think it makes a difference if this is run by NGOs and non-profit organizations? What are your feelings?
Yeah, I actually believe that NGOs actually do make a difference because some of them are actually the ones that are exposed to corruption. For example, the Kenya Community-Based Tourism Organization actually lobbied for the interests of poor communities who own land community and had ventured into Kenya's emerging ecotourism sector. Mm-hmm. But some of these NGOs, for example, the interests of the biodiversity conservation NGOs, their interests are very different from the interests of indigenous communities in development, even within the broad framework of a forested landscape. So these divergences affect the scale of the ecotourism project and the degree of participation of the local community.
Right.
So
two sides there as well, basically, then, yeah.
Yeah. So to summarize, I guess, if the NGO is really ecotourism based and wants to help the indigenous community, they could do a fantastic job because it seems like they're formed to help this community with the goal of helping these indigenous communities. So it seems like they have a more morally, I guess, right purpose than, for example, some of these investors who are only looking for profit.
Fair enough. So it was fantastic. Where can people find you if you want to be found, of course?
Well, actually, I have I'm a briefings writer for the Journal of Sustainable Development, so you can read some this article on Columbia's Journal of Sustainable Development and also on the state of the planet. And I have another article in works, so stay tuned. So I'll be publishing that in hopefully another week or so.
Oh, brilliant. Send me the link so I can put them in there as well. And is there anything that you would like to say at the end of the conversation? Anything that comes to mind that you missed or?
No, I think we covered pretty much everything.
Okay, great. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I think it's really good to have different points of view because you don't hear this very often. And I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Brilliant. All right, have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
So that was a podcast with Arooba Ahmed. I'll put all the links in the show notes, including the link to the great article that she wrote. You can find all the latest news on podcasts.earth. You have been listening to Peter de Vries. Thank you for doing so. And please don't forget to tune in next time for the latest in sustainability, responsible travel, wellness, and a lot of other things. Thank you.